Alrighty. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Hello. Perfect timing. Hello to all of our online watchers as well. Thank you so much for coming today. So I'm just going to kind of kick this off with an acknowledgement. So I'd firstly like to acknowledge that this meeting takes place on unceded Aboriginal land. We acknowledge and we thank the traditional owners and custodians of this land, the Darug and Gundungurra people. We would also like to pay our respects to any elders, both past, present and emerging. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to take a minute to just thank our sponsors and organisers. So a big thanks to the Women's Health and Resource Centre. I've been working closely with them to pull all of this together. We'd also like to say that today's action is an initiative of the Blue Mountains Coalition Against Violence and Abuse, otherwise known as CAVA, and it's been generously sponsored by the Zonta Club of the Blue Mountains, so a huge thank you to them. And if you're online and you hear some strange drumming noises, we have some little drums to kind of bring in the spirit of protest. Thank you today. So people may clap, people may use those, so that's what that is, just to clarify. Moving forward, I'm also just going to issue a bit of a trigger warning. So we're going to have a really kind of casual, free-flowing conversation today, and topics of violence and abuse may come up. If anyone at any point needs to take a break, please feel free to exit. That's totally fine, no judgment. And if anything comes up for you, you can always call 1-800-RESPECT to discuss and get support further. So I'm going to introduce us. I have to script because I'm an illustrator and I'm not used to talking to people, so I sit here with paper and that's what I do. So if you didn't know, my name's Ailie Banks. I've been a Blue Mountains local most of my life. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an illustrator now, a feminist and an author. To give some extra context to our conversation today, I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. I grew up in a domestic violence situation and I experienced abuse at the hands of my biological father. And as a result, I now live with a mental health condition called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise known as CPTSD. And I talk really openly about all of this on all of my platforms to hopefully try and alleviate some stigma and have important conversations like this one. So the woman I'm lucky to be talking to, I'm sure does not need an introduction, but just in case, I didn't know, this is our local MP, Trish Doyle. Now, Trish has been representing our community of the Blue Mountains in Parliament since 2015, and she has been a strong advocate for changing domestic violence and sexual assault laws, amongst many, many, many other things. In her amazing maiden speech, Trish spoke openly and honestly about her experience also dealing with domestic violence, and also about her experience living with a mentally ill partner. For these reasons and many, many more, I'm delighted to be in conversation with her today under the banner of Reclaim the Night. So thank you for coming.
Thanks.
So I thought that we would kind of, the way that we're going to structure this is we did do a call out for questions from the audience, both on and offline. I'm going to, rather than doing a formal Q&A, I'm going to kind of weave them into the conversation because we kind of want to keep this as organic and flowing as possible. But when we had our initial meeting online, I did flag with Trish that I would really like to talk about her support of the coercive control bill. And I kind of structured that into my call out to my audience for questions, and a lot of the feedback that we got back was that lots of people didn't even know what coercive control means. And so I thought we would kind of kick this off with asking you if you could kind of outline what coercive control is and how it might show up in our lives and community.
Thanks, Ailie. And just before I do that, it's so fantastic in what has been a very tough year for many to look out and see the faces of fabulous women that I have the deepest respect for. So thanks for being here, and I feel really honoured that you are so open and forthright and proud to call yourself a feminist. And you know, the next trailblazer blazing crew, Ailie. Thank you. Thanks to the Women's Health Centre, thanks to Zonta and Carver for bringing us together. In terms of coercive control, it's usually a term that organisations who work in that space of responding to domestic violence would be more familiar with than your average person, you know, that you might pass in the supermarket or in the street, or even, you know, if you're having an event with family, friends, or, you know, with your neighbours. And it was a term defined by Professor Stark, where he talked about a pattern of domination, and that pattern of domination includes a whole range of behaviours, and together those behaviours are about coercively controlling someone else. And some of the tactics in that control aim to violate, degrade, exploit, control victims, as well as to frighten them or hurt them physically. But coercive control and the discussion that has been happening in our country, Ailie, which is fantastic that it's become part of the national discourse, looks to define a little bit of those patterns of behaviour. And beyond that, there has been conversations from the women's movement, from those peak organisations and all of the bodies that work in that space for women and the prevention of domestic violence for decades. And finally, the conversation has shifted to criminalising coercive control behaviours. So recognising that it's not just a black eye or a broken arm that defines domestic violence. So Jess Hill, who came to prominence through a lot of her work with the media, but particularly in her book, See What You Made Me Do, says that domestic violence or domestic abuse occurs on a spectrum of power and control. And the movements that are monitored by someone who's seeking to control a victim is often called coercive control. So there are at the moment in New South Wales, there are two pieces of legislation. One is in draft format, which is Abigail Boyd from the Greens, her exposure draft bill, which is still circulating in the sector for comment. Another is a private member's bill that earlier this year my colleague, the member for Shell Harbour, after meeting a local family who lost their sister and their mum to domestic violence, where there wasn't any physical abuse, but it was years of coercive control. She sought to have some legislation drafted, and so Labor has introduced a bill into the lower house in New South Wales Parliament. And I think as a result of all the conversations, pressure from the sector, a range of bills that come from areas outside the government, has forced the Minister into announcing, which he just did last week, the Joint Select Committee. So it's people across the chambers who will come together, so parliamentarians who will seek witnesses and submissions from the sector over the next number of months, up until June next year, to look at coercive control. So he's been brought finally to the table to have the discussion as well. So I just thought I might, I was asked in a radio interview just recently on 702 Ailie to just go through what is in the bill that specifies what those behaviours are.
Yeah, that'd be
because
great.
and I think that's a good idea. So the bill criminalises conduct or behaviour or pattern of behaviours that do one or more of the following: making another person dependent on or subordinate to a person, isolating a person from their friends, their relatives, other sources of support, controlling, regulating or monitoring another person's day-to-day activities, and that often looks like determining when they use their phone, who they talk to, where they go, what they wear, what they can eat. Depriving another person of or restricting their freedom of action. Depriving another person or restricting another person's access to support services. So often we see that one person in a relationship will say to the other, where there is coercive control, you're not going to see your doctor, you're not going to check in with the Women's Health Centre, you're not going to meet up with your girlfriends. And behaviour that is frightening, humiliating, degrading or punishing another person. And I think that the bill that Labor has read into the chamber, so just introduced, it's yet to be debated, there is an offence that is in two parts, and one is looking at that pattern of behaviour, and where that has been determined that there is coercive control, there's a 5-year sentence applied to that. And as a child victim survivor myself, Ailie, it was really important for us to continue that conversation around where offence involves children. So there is an extra section to the bill that looks at the offence being aggravated if children are involved, if children are used, if children see or hear or used in the abuse. And that cops a 10-year sentence.
And that would make a huge difference in child.
It's a lot more complicated than, you know, a 5-minute summary of what coercive control might look like, what some of those patterns of behaviour might entail. I also think it's really important when I talk about this is to play the devil's advocate and throw out there that there are people, they're usually white privileged men who have some opposition to this proposed legislation or have some difficulty with the conversation, and I think it's good to just throw out there that when someone turns around, because it's good for us as we go out and talk to people and talk this up and the need to criminalise coercive control, when someone says, but what if he or what if they were just behaving poorly? You know, what if it was just, you know, a bit of bad behaviour? And, you know, that might be the case. It may not fit into a pattern of behaviours over a period of time. It might be poor behaviour, and I don't know how you determine that, but there is a statutory defence clause in Labor's legislation that doesn't criminalise an incident of poor behaviour. So when that incident or the behaviour can be deemed reasonable in particular circumstances.
So don't worry, you're protected if you're just acting terribly.
Well, I think that there would be very legitimate points that some people may raise here, and I think it's important to have that clause, absolutely important to have that clause, but at the same time, you cannot introduce laws in this state or in this country without having a whole heap of support wrapped around those laws. So we need to make sure that there is education in schools. And we need to make sure that our fabulous women's health centres and other organisations who teach what healthy relationships are in schools are funded to do that. We need to make sure that all the services that wrap themselves around families are funded with case managers. We need to make sure that there is an increase in investment in police training. There needs to be magistrates and people within the legal system who are trained and familiar and aware of the sensitivities around these issues as well. So
it's extremely nuanced and complex as a concept in general. I've had a couple of questions come in regards to coercive control in particular. The first one's from Isla Curtis, and they ask, do any of our existing laws protect against coercive control if the victim is not being physically abused? And if not, by legislating against physical domestic abuse but not mental abuse, are we being dismissive of the importance of mental health?
So there are components in current legislation which the Minister has, Minister Speakman, who is the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, and also the State's Attorney General. So he's flagged a review of basically the Crimes, Domestic Violence and Personal Violence Act.
Yeah.
There are components to answer Isla's question. There are components within that Act that are under the heading of stalking, intimidation with intent to cause fear of physical or mental harm. Mm-hmm. So that is included in Section 13 of the Crimes Act now, but it doesn't go far enough. Like, it's only a partial acknowledgement. Why? And that's why there are so many people who, and rightly so, who say we need to go further with, instead of having bits and pieces in different acts, we need to have a standalone domestic violence law.
And there was another question that came in from Lily online, and they asked, how might coercive control interplay with alternate states? For example, being drunk or being in a poor mental health state.
That's a really tough one, and I think that if our criminal justice system works more closely with our women's services, and there is a respect of what no means no, and there is an understanding of the impact of mental stability and all its variations, then this is part of educating community, isn't it? And we know in terms of domestic violence and sexual assault, and I'm sure that there are many of our experts here in the audience today who can talk to the fact that if a woman around domestic violence or sexual assault or sexual harassment wants to take it further, wants to do something about that with the legal system, then she will be accused of bringing it on herself because of the fact that she'd been drinking, or what she was wearing, or that she indicated in other non-verbal ways that she was keen. We need to challenge all of that, and I don't know whether it's just within the legal system and whether we can actually capture that within a piece of legislation, because as I said before, it needs that whole of community approach, a holistic approach here. So the teacher in me and the parent in me feels it's so important to pump resources into schools and to have young people from a very early age talk about what healthy relationships look like and what they don't look like, what healthy behaviours are.
Because I find that, when I was thinking about my experience with coercive control, it's so subtle and easily hidden. And I think when I also look back on relationships I had when I was in my teens and in high school, that behaviour also was present in those very early relationships. And it's kind of this like dynamic where I think if you're in a heterosexual, but I'm sure even homosexual situation, that kind of idea of like needing to dominate and control is supposed to be seen as desirable. See, I want you so much that, you know what I mean? And I think lots of the young women that I was having conversations with when I asked these questions were kind of confused about the subtleties and like, but doesn't this mean that he likes me type of thing? And if he doesn't want me to see other boys, isn't that just because he likes me the most and blah, blah, blah? So I think it happens super early,
It does.
People are being presented with what coercive control is, but they're not necessarily trained to know how to spot it.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting components of media reporting here, and they have a duty of care in how they report some of these incidents, especially where it's sensational and there's been the death of a woman, is absolutely critical to that point that you make, Ailie. And that's, you know, at what point is behaviour that might make you feel uncomfortable sometimes, and maybe other times not, form a bit of a pattern that you actually realise when it's maybe too late, is problematic. The most sort of highly targeted story, personal story, was when Hannah Clark and her 3 children were killed in Queensland, and it was the stories that her friends and her family told about what her life was like. Now, she wasn't physically harmed, but for years the father of her children controlled her, and she eventually needed to escape that. Eventually she had to move away from him. But what the New South Wales Domestic Violent Death Review team tells us is that when those steps are taken, when there is finally some acknowledgement, self-acknowledgement, because it is about the self rather than other people saying that that's not good, that doesn't look good, that doesn't sound good. That is important to do that. But when that self-acknowledgement happens and there are steps to move yourself away from those behaviours, coercive control behaviours are in 97% of cases a red flag to homicide. So it wasn't until she moved away with the kids into with her parents that he tracked her down. And there, sadly, are too many stories like that, and many of them don't see you know, a sensationalised media focus.
And I also think that you know, the subtlety and the very long, often long and slow build-up that happens with coercive control offers a lot of opportunities for people to hold that person accountable, but because we're not educated on what coercive control is, and because maybe his mates aren't educated on what coercive control looks like, there's things, you know, when you've been in a situation where there's things where you're like, that doesn't feel right, but I don't have the language for it. I don't know that this is a time where I say, hey, that's not okay, you know? And so I think, having these conversations is super important, and raising awareness. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is from Sian in the audience. So she says, within my university studies, I came across a Guardian article stating that 64% of young women within a study had experienced abuse, but many of them didn't even realise it. It has come to my attention that abusive relationships are often overlooked in teens and young people. As a young woman, I'm asking, what can we do as a community to prevent or decrease these rates?
What a fantastic question, and the fact that there's some insight, there's some fantastic insight there. I feel that when young women come together, or young people have discussions about really tough issues, whatever it might be, but where the centre is about unhealthy behaviours in relationships or friendships, that's a great start. I would say, as I've already mentioned a few times, having those conversations in a safe space is critical. Finding someone in the school environment, finding someone in the family environment, raising that in the education system. I see here that we've got a representative from Katoomba High School, and I won't forget not long after, it's great to have a Katoomba High School representative. I remember not long after being elected, and there was still quite a bit of interest, and there's still people still stop me in the street today to talk about my inaugural speech, but I was asked to come into platoon behind to talk to some of the senior students about the fact that even though it's tough, we have to have conversations about the stuff that troubles us and the stuff that happens behind closed doors, and some of the attitudes that we will encounter from people in our own family or our friends, you know, or the guy or the girl that we like might say something that just completely, you know, shocks you, but you decide that you're going to ignore. Those conversations are very important in the first place, and again, I would like to see huge investment in local services with a trauma-informed framework and with a feminist framework, move into the schools and do more work there. So that's, to talk about abuse relationships. But doing this, coming together, and just beyond an event that we call Reclaim the Night, beyond an annual or a couple of events that might happen in a year where we come together, there needs to be more of that happens at an informal level. So,
and in school, because that's where it all starts, really. I feel like that whole environment where there's a lot of toxic masculinity. I mean, we've been dealing with our EV girls, who are, a lot of them are in high school, have been talking about their experiences with toxic masculinity and that kind of thing in high school. And a lot of them spoke about this one particular thing that was happening in school. Whenever a boy would kind of stand up for a girl in a situation, the other boys around him would call him something called a simp, which is kind of this like insult to him that, you know, he's going against the rules, you're not supposed to stand with women, that kind of thing. So I think it starts so early and so subtly in these ways that will then lead into these bigger problems.
So finding safe spaces to talk about the issues, finding safe spaces to talk about what you do around those issues. And there's never any one particular answer. So I think when I have spoken at that school, and I spoke to a group of young women after, some of them who I think for the first time had something, there was a bit of a trigger, and they needed to just reach out and say, hey, thanks. It's the supports we wrap around events like that make all the difference. But when we have a stereotypical setup, and things aren't always presented in a stereotypical way, but young men who really struggle, who have been in situations themselves, or young men who act out, or young men who behave badly, and having their friendship, their peers, their friendship groups call them out on that is absolutely essential. And how we do that, like equipping our young people with the skills on how we do that. Part of my privilege in being a parliamentarian it has been, in the last few years, been asked to go into the theaterette at Parliament whenever they have a young Leaders Day, and especially a Young Women in Leadership Day. And I said to the Education Unit once, you've invited me along to so many of these, like, don't you share them around? Don't you get like other members of Parliament from across the political spectrum to come and sit down and take questions and talk with all these young people? And she said, yep, we do. But we also respond to the feedback we get from the young people, and after these sessions, they always say that your honesty about some of these really tough issues really resonated with them, and they want you to be part of it. So that's like a huge privilege that I have in talking to these young people. There was a young woman actually with a disability who said that she felt really invisibilised on all sorts of levels, as a woman, as someone with a disability, and that she is often targeted, and a lot of her friends and family not quite sure how they respond to that. So those skills are needed part of that program, once I told the story to a young group of kids who said that they didn't feel like there was much hope in change. So once they become aware, once there are conversations, or if there has been an incident that's impacted someone, they're usually lost. You know, once you start doing some research or you have a conversation, you get lost in this quagmire of the statistics and the high incidence of sexual violence, and it is gendered. And so I had this young group who together said, you know, we feel like we're a bit hopeless, like it's a hopeless situation, we're a bit helpless here. And you know, what could they do? And I said, well, a group of you will more likely than not attend an end of year party, and there will more likely than not be drugs and alcohol there, so that will come into play. It's the end of the year, it'll be celebration, there'll be people who feel anxious about that, there'll be people who feel really high about that. And I can tell you what's more likely than not in a number of those parties, there will be someone who is abused. That the statistics tell us that. So if you see that, if you hear that, you speak up, you stand up, you speak out, you fight back.
The information.
Yeah, so you know this now. And don't be afraid not to speak. And I tell them about a young person who, a young woman who stopped me on the street a few years back, and a handful of years back. And she said to me, you don't know who I am, and you don't need to. But I was at a party last weekend, and as I was coming down the stairs in this massive house with a mass amount of young people who are all in different stages of being affected by drugs or alcohol, and excitement. And there was, you know, music pumping, and it was great, but, you know, she said, I knew something was wrong, and I was coming down the stairs, and there was another young woman, I don't know who she was passed out at the foot of the stairs, and there were a group of 3 guys, she said, I'd never seen before, I don't think they were local, and they were deciding who was going to go first, basically who was going to rape her first, and she was unconscious. And she said, and I just froze, and I didn't know why I couldn't speak or move. She said, I just froze on the stairs. And she said, and then this young guy comes in. He walks out of the kitchen, and he comes in and he stops and he says, who are you blokes? And they turned around and he goes, well, I don't think she can say yes or no. There's the door.
Yeah, and I find that, like, the thing is that, you know, we have to, what I think about a lot is, you know, because I attend a lot of women-only spaces and events like this, and something that I have a lot of male peers. My long-term partner is a man, you know, and these are conversations that we're having together because I'm out here doing this, right? But I think that men really need to be brought into the conversation, because you have to think about all the layers that go into it. You know, women are socialized differently, and they're often socialized to not speak up and be assertive in that manner. And I think a lot of the time I have seen similar situations where a man who has usually been educated by the women around him will stand up in a certain situation like that, and it will give everyone onus to also stand up and back him, including his male friends. And so I think moving forward, and I know that a lot of the Gen Z kids that my partner works with, who are, you know, all 17, 18 and below boys, they are trying to be part of this conversation as well. But there aren't necessarily spaces for them to kind of speak about what it is to be discriminated against for standing up for women, which is such a part of it as well. And so I think, like, we need to start bringing young men into the conversation as well, for sure, because it's really effective when you've got lots of voices. And unfortunately, men who are going to assault women don't listen to women. I've been in the situation many times where I'm, you know, barking at someone and they roll their eyes because I'm a woman and they don't care what I have to say. But when a man will step in, which is usually my partner, you know, all of a sudden that voice holds more weight. And while that's extremely frustrating and there's a lot to unpack there is this kind of like, well, yeah, okay, I need you to speak here because we need to stand together on this, you know?
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah,
Ailie.
yeah.
It goes to the broader picture. I'm going to switch roles here, and I'm going to interview you for a moment. No. I'm just. When you were talking about that, about the voice and the weight that is held in a public space, and often in the private space as well, by men over women, it just reminded me of some of the work I was doing earlier this year. So I'm the Shadow Minister for Emergency Services, I'm the Shadow Minister for Women, and the Shadow Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. And all of those roles in this year have overlapped, and there is a layering in different ways. And the picture that is painted in a tough year like this one is pretty dire. So coming out of drought, fire, flood, and then into the pandemic, and looking at who was impacted more, we can point to the fact that women make up the foundational economy. They're the ones, Emma Dawson, who works for Per Capita Australia, look up her research, she's incredible, points to the fact that it's all in the workplaces and the sectors that were responsible for the response to all of these crises, and for the pandemic. It's usually women-heavy sectors. And yet, when we're talking about coming out of all of those natural disasters and the crises of a pandemic, what does government, with the big loud male voice, point to as our salvation? A hard hat and a high-vis vest. Not investment in to build roads primarily. So hard hats and high-vis vests and blokes building roads so we can, you know, get more cars on more roads. Rather than, if there's going to be infrastructure investment, rather than social housing, for example, so that women who are in domestic violence situations, or women who are the over 50, who are the highest percentage of those facing homelessness, can have access to affordable housing. So I think that in how we respond in government and how that is reported in the media is a huge part of actually hearing women's voices. It's not just about assault and women being victims, but it's about the work that women do being valued, and it's usually in the community and social services sector. We wouldn't have got through this pandemic or any of these crises if it wasn't for the women in those sectors. So a big shout out to our and especially those who work in that really tough space, the prevention of DV, responding to sexual assault, who work with those who are the most vulnerable, and that's usually women and children who are homeless or escaping domestic violence. So that's where I think that media and government can respond as well, is by investing in supports to lift up the people that actually do the support work at the tough times. So,
well, we actually had a question come in relation to kind of housing and what you were just talking about from Joe Robinson. So they say vacancy rates in the Nepean Blue Mountains area are incredibly low at the moment, and prices are rising beyond the reach of many of Wentworth's homelessness clients, who are often on very low incomes. What do you believe the New South Wales government could be doing to stop rents increasing to the point where most people on low incomes can no longer afford to rent privately and become homeless due to the shortage of social housing? And there is an emphasis there on how that affects women and children.
Yeah, so we had, our state governments do rely on money that flows from the federal government as well, and sadly we have seen a lost opportunity with the federal government failing to make announcements about huge investment in social housing. We will soon see what the New South Wales government comes up with, but I can pretty much guarantee that will be more hard hats and high-vis vests and roads rather than in social infrastructure. I really do think that coming out of the recession that they've announced we're in, but also just the impact, the social impact of a year that's been really tough for lots of people, for their mental health. There's a high rate of unemployment. There's been a high incidence of domestic and family violence and sexual violence, and just people feel that it's been a tough time.
Yeah.
We need to look after our most vulnerable, and if beyond JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and I know that there are a lot of people here who work in the sector and expecting the absolute worst outcomes once a lot of those people crash. If only governments were focused on that social impact and looked after those who and prevent them from actually taking that next step towards homelessness. So those who rent.
Like me.
And just
forever.
Working with real estate, community, working with real estate, working with government, putting where possible, assisting landowners to enable them to look after their tenants, encouraging that rather than this kind of conquer and divide attitude. I mean, there's a huge attitudinal change that's required here as well. So I would like to see, similar to the midst of the pandemic where there was a bit of a freeze for people who were struggling with mortgage repayments and paying rents, for some sort of stopgap measure to be instituted by government in that space. I don't know what it might look like, but I do know that it actually is transport and roads and finance that takes precedence when government ministers sit together, not the person who looks after housing and homelessness and community service sector. But if only they listen to the experts who are dealing with the fallout on the ground about what might work. The answers are there. I look forward to actually seeing what NCOS, the National Council of Social Services, put forward as part of recommendations for the New South Wales government in their budget. And I know that the very foundation of women and families at risk and the community services sector, and lifting them up lifts us all up, because the cost down the track of hospitalisation, the cost
emergency
when
housing.
when you don't invest in affordable social housing is monumental.
And I sense for a lot of my female friends who are single parents and stuff like that, there is a worry that once JobKeeper, JobSeeker finishes officially in March, isn't it? That there's a worry about that rent pressure and all that kind of stuff, and they've said to me, that it's a very fine line of how long can I keep paying this and keeping a roof. So it all kind of ties in. But so I'm going to move on to the next question. So this one comes from Kerry Miller, and they say, it is recognised that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience violence at higher rates than the rest of the population. What projects or programs would you like to see introduced to change this?
Well, thanks to Kerry for that question. Thank you, Kerry, and thanks, Ailie, for
speaking for
speaking. It's not what programs or projects I'd like to see introduced, but I think there needs to be an acknowledgement by government for those who have decision-making power to be respectful of our First Nations people in the first instance and listen to what programs and projects they believe are needed. This problem is that we have people making decisions who have no grounding in real life at times, I feel.
Let alone in First Nations communities.
Yeah. So, I mean, I actually just 2 days ago spent my time with a number of services on the Central Coast, and I met up with the Central Coast Regional Domestic Violence Committee.
Yeah.
And I spoke to two aunties in that committee who said to me that the biggest change that they'd like to see to funding cycles and funding models is an acknowledgement and a respect for our First Nations people, because what they have to do, which is it's already hard enough for those who have to employ someone to write grant applications almost solidly through the funding cycle year, and who have to do more every financial year with less money. But for those very particular Aboriginal services that are dealing with their kin, they have to jump through twice as many, at least twice as many hoops. Their compliance regulations are much harder, and we already know how tough it is. So there is this almost distrust and a deep disrespect. Yeah. So I think that if we listen to frontline workers and frontline services about what they need, it's not what I think, or it's not what the Minister thinks, or it's not what the Premier thinks or the Treasurer thinks. It's about listening and having that respect for people who work at the front line. We do know that our First Nations people and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander women experience higher rates of violence, and some of our elders have some ideas about what might work best for different communities. And I don't think any model that comes from the Minister's office and has overlaid a particular community is going to work. More funding, more case managers, more housing, so that those who want to move themselves away from violence have options.
And more Aboriginal people in positions of power to make those decisions.
Yes, and so I said to one of these fantastic Indigenous women that years ago, when Mike Baird stopped me in the Fountain Foyer in Parliament and asked me how it was all going, whether I was enjoying my time as a local member. I hadn't been in the place long. I said to him, I am, but I really feel out of place here, mate. Like, this is not my world. I didn't plan, like a lot of you people did, to be in Parliament one day. I was just living life, and I had an opportunity and took it, and here I am. I said, but I tell you what, here's a really good idea. From time to time, members should stay at home in their electorates, and they should nominate someone in their community, and we should set up a People's Parliament. Yeah. I said, so you lot can all stay there. You can have the Premier and the Treasurer and all the ministers.
And leave your jargon at home.
Yeah, but I would so love to say, you know what, I've had a gut full of you lot lately, but I'm appointing Kerry, and she's going to come in and she's going to represent the Blue Mountains for the next she's going to tell you a thing or two. I think that would be great, to appoint a teacher or a nurse or a firefighter or someone who works in the community services sector, like a real person, to walk into that chamber and to have, you've got a captive audience, and to say, right, this is what we need.
And I think young people would love to see that, because the conversations that I have with my peers and with younger women online especially, is it's very easy to be disengaged with the current political climate, and it's very easy to get lost in the jargon and the legislation and all of that, when really what you want is you want kind of a human to human, what are we going to do and how are you going to represent me, on a kind of grounded place. And I think I would love that. Make it happen, right?
It wasn't surprising that he looked at me as if I was just like a
insane.
I could see, he smiled, because Mike Baird was always that really personable kind of character. He smiled, but in his eyes I could see he was thinking, who is this Fruit Loop? You know, who on earth is she? But that's just it. Real people who live real lives need to have their voices heard in the Parliament and in those decisions that are made, and that's why it's really important to have someone who is your representative take your voice into the Parliament. But you know, I have to say it. I have to, because the personal is political is personal.
Yeah.
If we want the kinds of social policies and the money attached and the investment attached to those policies, and government to act on those policies, not just talk about it, but walk their talk, then we have to change government.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge problem with elitism and often cases, you know, uneducated people who maybe don't understand all that jargon or don't have access to understanding the political system get left behind. Yeah. And I think I think we need to change the whole thing. But on to the next. That's a whole other meeting we could be having. So we have another awesome input, and I'm going to pronounce their name wrong probably, but it's from SJ. I'm not going to say your last name because I'll say it wrong. Even though I come from an Eastern European Polish background, I'm really sorry, I won't even attend. I think that... Stazak! Okay, Stazak? Okay, where's that from?
That's the Aussie version, I think Staszak is Polish.
Polish. I'm also come from... So sorry to anyone Polish who's watching. They said, I received a very large compensation claim and trusted a professional to manage it for me. Unfortunately, I became a victim of financial abuse. My question is, are there existing community services supporting people to reduce their risk of abuse when receiving large sums such as compensation? And are there ways we can improve general protections for women from financial abuse? Thanks for your question.
Yeah, tough question. Like I think that'll take a week to answer that one, SJ.
Wrap it up.
I'll just touch briefly on that because it is huge. There's lots of different elements to this question, and I'll also acknowledge that Marie from Zonta also asked some questions about money and finance has been a really important tool to women's women being able to move out of abusive relationships and abusive or away from abusive situations. So that empowerment around financial skills is absolutely key. There are really good services, there are really good people in a range of services who would provide that support in community. I think about a presentation that we had in Parliament recently from the whole array of community legal centres across New South Wales, and particularly because it spoke to me about skills that I once really struggled with myself as a sole parent. From the financial legal centre, and so there's a whole range of community legal centres, and I think that if anyone ever finds themselves in a particular difficulty because of a particular situation, whether it's around domestic violence or whether it's just around the situation that you've outlined, SJ, with an amount of money that you were ripped off with, by the sounds of it.
Management around large lump sums. Who should have access to that.
Who should have access to that. So in the first instance, I would say get some legal advice from one of your community legal centres, and there is the finance centre that you
and I guess in our finalised video we can drop some resources in the links, like local resources.
But I mean, in any community, and ours, I have to talk up our Blue Mountains Community Services sector, because I think that collaborative interagency approach is just brilliant. You know, you would reach out to the Elizabeth Evatt Legal Centre, or you would talk to your local neighbourhood centre, and because we have this interagency approach and everyone knows everyone, if one particular agency or service can't help, they know someone who can. And it often is, I have to say, it's often really good women. It's individual women who network And if they can't help, they'll
have
put you
lived
onto someone.
experience
And
a lot of
they,
the
a
time.
lot of them have lived experience too, Ailie. That's absolutely spot on.
Which is really important.
But, you know, interestingly, my two sons and their girlfriends raised this with me not so long ago, that there's a real gap in our education system too, that more likely than not will impact women, but it just impacts young people. And that is, you know, they will go in and they'll be taught how to analyse some sort of Shakespearean
Pythagoras theorem.
And you know, that's all well and good, but there is a whole range of like life skills, and a lot of those life skills around how you manage money and where you get advice if you're having difficulties with a situation. So
that's actually something that has come up time and time again, that gap. Especially me going into freelancing and have a lot of, because it's a millennial thing, we're all freelancers now, and none of us knew how to go about tax, and none of us knew how to invoice, and particularly a lot of us being women, money can be so freeing when you know how to manage it correctly, but there is a gap between schooling and how to manage your money.
Absolutely. So imagine if one of the sort of toolkit subjects at school involved, you know, the Women's Health and Resource Centre team, like if there was funding for the, you know, the local legal centre to get together with the Neighbourhood Centre, the Women's Health Centre, and come in and talk to young women about some of the
life skills,
some of those life skills that you will need to have, and actually hands-on, you know, work through forms and talk about tax and talk about the importance of investing in your superannuation and talk about the gender pay gaps and the things that you need to be aware of once you move out of school.
And how to advocate for yourself in the workplace in terms of pay negotiation and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Well, it's also educating and politicising and empowering people once you do know, even if what you learn is that you are at a disadvantage. And that there are things, once you learn that there are things you don't know, or the things you don't have, or there are things you cannot access because of being, you know, a woman, or a woman who's in a tough situation, whether it's a financial situation, a family situation, whatever it might be. But imagine if we actually did equip people with those skills. It's so empowering to then make change. So, you know, I come back to the importance of schools and our curriculum, but there is already such a huge workload and a very stressful workload on our teachers and our schools. So they can't just do that. They're more and more doing work of families and of governments and of services. So we need to actually value our teachers and our schools and pay them more and invest more there.
Well, I think everything that we've talked about today kind of all wraps into each other, and it all kind of merges. And I think, you know, I feel like it's been a really positive conversation, and I hope no one's been too dragged down by statistics or the realities of things. But I know Trish and I, we did want to kind of end on a bit of a call to action. So something that you can take away from today's meeting and do something that's going to have a bit of an impact. So take it away.
Excellent. So Ailie and I were having a chat, and she can talk to this in a moment, about reaching out to members of parliament. They're the ones who walk into the chamber, or they have conversations in their caucus rooms first about the sorts of issues that they're going to highlight and that they're going to prioritise. And they're going to talk about. So reaching out to members of parliament, especially conservative ones, and encouraging them to listen to your voice and what you think needs to be prioritised by governments is really important. So Ailie might talk to that in a moment about an idea that she has, but it worked really, really well last year during the abortion law reform debate, which went on for some time. So people might recall that across the political spectrum, members of parliament came together, whatever sort of political colours that they wore, and worked together for abortion law reform, for women's reproductive health rights. And it was a step that Our Bodies, Our Choice, and a group of young women, and one of their sort of activities that really made a huge difference there. So I'll let Ailie talk about that. But I'm going to say to everyone who's watching, everyone who's here, and share this around. We'll put the link up later.
Yeah.
Go to Instagram or Facebook and look up Women's Safety New South Wales, and they're working with some of those mainstream media that usually reach out to women who might not be in this space with us, and asking them as part of a joint petition on criminalising coercive control. This is their call for action. So there's a link on Insta, and there's a link on Facebook for Women's Safety New South Wales, criminalising coercive control. And just a shout out to the good bloke whose name I've forgotten, sorry, but there's a good bloke out there who works somewhere in the bureaucracy of Women's Day, Marie Claire, all of those women's magazines, who reached out to me when I first talked to the media about the need to criminalise coercive control and about legislation, and he said, what can we do? What can we do? And I said, if you get together and you talk to the organisations that work at the coalface, who work at the front line. So I put them in contact with Women's Safety in New South Wales, which is the old WDV-CAS, the Court Assistance Scheme, Domestic Violence New South Wales. They all work together, all the peaks, the Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia. All these fabulous people who've been working for a long time are the ones who are behind the push here, and they've all come together to encourage people, not just women, but people across Australia to sign this petition. So it's not just New South Wales, but every state and in the federal jurisdiction, that we actually start making laws and taking action against those who abuse. So,
Great. That's our first task. Everyone online, it will be in the link. So when I was talking to Trish, she gave me some great insight, because if you've been following me, and I'm talking to everyone in this room obviously, but a lot to my audience on Instagram. So, you know, online at the moment there's been a lot of discourse around activism and how to make things happen, particularly in an online way, during COVID and all that kind of thing. And a lot of that has been, you know, sharing and signing kind of digital petitions and that kind of thing. But Trish informed me that something that really got her attention, which is maybe something that we millennial and young people don't think about so often, is that she really paid attention to when someone sent her a physical postcard with a handwritten note of what they were kind of asking for and what they wanted to for her to support. And I have a lot of amazingly creative friends out there, and I thought that maybe in the next few weeks we would put together a postcard that we could get you to kind of print off at home if you wanted to, and send out to a list of pollies that we will kind of add as well, to get their attention in kind of a physical sense. So she gave me the scoop, and we're now going to take that on. And so I think with that we will end our talk today. Thank you, Trish, so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Ailie. I'm actually I'm really inspired by your energy and your truth telling, in much the same way that years ago when I found myself at uni and I made friends with old Margaret Jones, who I'm just going to note here. She was a huge mentor and inspiration for me, and she's left this world now, but I've got her hat sitting here. She gave me a beautiful ceramic badge which said, "Dare to struggle, dare to win," and I often wear that into Parliament on days where my energy is depleted. But it's more the fact that she was so inspirational. She was an older woman when I first met her who encouraged the young women to speak up and to tell our truth. And now as, you know, I'm moving into my mid-50s, I am so inspired by you, Ailie.
And me by you.
Keep at it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone online. Yeah, and reclaim the night. Perfect.
Excellent.
Cool. Thanks everyone.
It's really